Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. I hope you're doing well, inshallah. I'm in a very beautiful location, as you can see, and I thought this is a great opportunity to talk about something else that's very beautiful and very interesting, which is an object called 3i Atlas. The 3i Atlas, I'm going to give the name first. 3i stands for the third interstellar object that we have discovered as humanity in our solar system. Interstellar. So, a bit of background. The solar system is our sun, planets going around the sun, as well as any other objects that have a regular path around the sun. And interstellar, of course, being between stars. So, 3i Atlas is very significant because it's only the third object that we've discovered in our solar system that has come and originated from another area that isn't in our sun's orbit. And that is an amazing discovery. I'm going to touch on why there's only been 3 and touch on why that's so significant. But I'm going to shift over to the second part of the name, Atlas. So Atlas is the observatory that has detected 3i Atlas. And often with these interstellar objects that have been discovered, so the first one being Oumuamua, second one being Borisov, and the third one being 3i Atlas, of course. The name comes from the area, region, or person that discovered it. And Atlas is a observatory in Chile, I believe. So that explains the Atlas bit. But yeah, 3i Atlas. Now you understand the name. Let's go a bit into what it actually is. 3i Atlas is a extremely unusual object that has originated and come into our solar system. Originated outside the solar system, as I mentioned, has come into our solar system at a very unusual angle. Because you can imagine, we have a star here, the sun. We have Mercury, Venus, Earth in a bigger orbit, Mars in a bigger orbit, Jupiter in an even bigger orbit, Saturn, Uranus, and then Neptune, and then Pluto, of course, which has been denoted as a planet but still exists and goes around even further. And then you have things that come even, then you have like these things called the Kuiper Belt, which is a selection of like comet-like objects that are orbiting even further than Pluto. But you could see what I was doing there with my hands. Everything seems to be in this plane, right? So we have the sun here and we have the Earth orbiting in this plane. We have Mercury orbiting in this plane. It's not like Earth is orbiting in this plane and Mercury is orbiting like this. And that's typical, right? Like in the solar system, the majority of the objects are orbiting along this particular plane, big objects. With the other 2 interstellar objects that I mentioned, Oumuamua and Borisov, they came perpendicular to the plane. So they came at different angles like this because, of course, they're originating from outside our solar system. So why should they come in at the same plane as the objects in our solar system? So they came in at different perpendicular to the plane, whereas with 3i Atlas it's actually come in on the plane, which is extremely unusual. I think the probability of that happening is like 1 out of 400 or so. Yeah, just really unusual. And because of the angle that it's coming in at, it gives it the opportunity to interact a lot more closely with a lot more of the planets than a typical interstellar object would. Because a typical interstellar object will come like this, so it would have a very short period of time interacting with any planets that just happen to be in that loop area. Whereas 3i Atlas is coming in at the angle that the planets are orbiting at, so it gives it a good opportunity to get close to a lot of the planets. Now, of course, carry on a little bit about what 3i Atlas is. 3i Atlas is a very unusual object. So when we've been analysing it, it seems to have a core between the range of just a few kilometers to 46 kilometers big. So the actual like solid part of it is a few kilometers. And if it's up to 46 kilometers, which some of the research had been showing, or if it's even like a few, like 5-10 kilometers, it's a very large object, right? Because it's the biggest interstellar object that we've ever seen if it falls more towards that higher range. And that makes it very significant because the first interstellar object we saw, Oumuamua, was only a few hundred meters across. So yeah, it's a That's the amazing thing. That's such a big object, and it's not just the core. So the core is a few kilometers across, and then it has a massive kind of bubble or gas or emission area around the core, which is hundreds of thousands of kilometers across. So if you actually look at the entire size of this kind of bubble around the core, that actually measures to around, I believe 300,000 kilometers, which is like almost half the size of the sun. Now, of course, it's very dissipated and it's like barely noticeable if you're going through this kind of outer shell of 3i Atlas, but there is this weird zone around it which seems to be elevated in association with 3i Atlas. So that's another thing very interesting to note. It's quite a large object if you take into its totality. Upon analysing the actual core of 3i Atlas, a very interesting thing arises in the fact that its core has been emitting nickel but not iron. Now typically iron and nickel in nature are found in conjunction with each other, especially in our solar system. It's pretty much impossible to find nickel separated from iron, because iron and nickel in our solar system are found often in conjunction with one another, as I said. But in human processing, like when we're processing materials, of course we separate the nickel out. And what's very interesting is in 3i Atlas we have a situation where we're detecting nickel but we're not detecting iron. Now that's very highly unusual. Of course people are thinking, oh, this is aliens, this, that, the other, but it could also be because it originates from a completely different part of the universe, and the composition in that part of the universe may be very different to the solar system that we have, therefore it arising like that. And I've seen some stuff around about it due to the star it potentially could have originated from, it having that composition. But yeah, nonetheless, it's very interesting to note the nickel thing. And let's just go on a game here, for example, and just go with the interesting hypothesis it's an alien object. With my background, I'm quite familiar on a lot of materials, and if it was an alien object, it's very interesting because according to my research, aliens would typically pick from two elements as being their spaceships, titanium and nickel. For me, those are the two best materials to build a spaceship from. So it's very interesting. It just happens to be nickel that it's emitting a lot of. Another thing that's very interesting about 3i Atlas is, like, typically when we see objects like 3i Atlas in our solar system, which are comets, they emit quite a high degree of H2O, water, in relation to CO2. Whereas with 3i Atlas, it's completely flipped, and I believe it's emitting like 5 times the amount of CO2 as H2O. So this is highly unusual. Something like that we've ever seen in our solar system before. And it's just an interesting thing. Another thing that's very interesting about 3i Atlas is the nature of its surface and the nature of its emissions. Rather than being quite heavily grainy like typical in comets, it's far more fine, like on the scale of like micron level. And this is very interesting because when we're looking at in our solar system and we look at typical comets, they're typically a lot larger in their grain size. So it's displaying multiple unusual behaviors. And yeah, I know everyone is like going crazy about it being aliens and stuff, but even if it's not, it's a very interesting object and something that, and it's likely not, of course, but it's something that definitely deserves further investigation and will like really push the boundaries of science, looking at such an interesting object. Another thing, I'm just rattling off things here about 3i Atlas that's very interesting, but another thing that comes to mind is when it was first detected, it was very red. It was typical coloration of certain objects that we have in the Kuiper belt, so like comet-like objects that are beyond Neptune. They had the coloration typical of those, whereas when it's been coming into our solar system and it's getting closer and closer to the sun, it's suddenly shifted from a reddish color to a bright green color, and it's very noticeable. You can see it in telescopes. I think a telescope in Namibia witnessed it recently, and it had a very bright green, electric green kind of color, which is really beautiful. And there's many hypotheses about why that could have been. One of the ones I lean towards is because of it being of an exotic makeup, like it being purely nickel, this could be due to special exotic kind of chemistry going on in 3i Atlas, where nickel compounds are reacting this, that, the other, and it's producing this bright green, because we're aware in chemical reactions nickel does often produce this kind of bright green. So it's not like a spaceship turning on green. I mean, it's likely not that, we can't say for sure, but it's not likely that. It's likely like this exotic chemistry going on. It could also be exotic chemistry with CN2 going on. But yeah, yeah, it's very interesting regardless. Yeah. And yeah, there's plenty of unusual things about 3i Atlas. But like the last thing I want to kind of touch on, and maybe I'll address some other things in the comment section, and feel free to ask me any questions about 3i Atlas in the comment section. I'll try and address them as best I can. But what's very interesting is, I kind of alluded to the pathway it's taking through the solar system, but it's very interesting. It's like going to have a very close approach to the planet Mars. I think towards the end of this year, it's going to have a very close approach to Mars. It's actually on the and it's actually going to keep its distance from Earth as much as possible, which is very interesting, because we have the sun in the middle, we have Mars on one side of the sun at this point of time, and we have Earth on the other side of the sun at this point of time. And 3i Atlas is going actually towards Mars and other planets as well. It's approaching them, but it's keeping a lot of distance from Earth. Now, of course, this could be coincidental, but yeah, it's very interesting. And of course, like, there's been crazy hypothesis about this. People have been saying, oh, the reason that this is happening is because you should always attack with the sun behind you. And if you're an alien spacecraft coming in with the sun behind you, so like they're thinking like 3i Atlas is going to go behind the sun and then suddenly switch its attack mode towards Earth, and then we won't be able to detect it in time. Which I guess we'll see if that happens, but it's highly unlikely. It's just more likely it's just a case of randomness, and it's just gone that way. But what that does leave, it leaves us in an interesting predicament, because we're not going to be able to actually see 3i Atlas soon. It's going to actually go behind the sun, so we're not going to be able to detect it from Earth until the new year, the new solar year. So, but we do have probes around Mars. So what's going to happen is they're going to shift their focus to 3i Atlas, hopefully, and we're going to actually be able to observe quite close images of 3i Atlas based on the probes we have around Mars. And then when it re-emerges behind the sun, we'll be able to observe it again in the new year, but then it will start to move away from the sun, because, as I mentioned, it's coming from outside the solar system. It's not an object that orbits the sun, so it's only doing a one-time pass of the sun. So then it's gonna, as it goes around the sun, it's gonna start to like head off. When it starts heading off, it's gonna actually it's gonna start moving out and further towards the planet Jupiter. So actually, there's this very interesting thing. So it's gonna, it's gonna start leaving the solar system. As it starts moving towards Jupiter, we have a probe around Jupiter called Juno, and that probe is actually coming towards the end of its lifetime. It was actually due to be decommissioned September 2025 or 2026, one of these. And now a lot of scientists are actually pushing for that probe, instead of it being decommissioned and launched into Jupiter for destruction purposes, instead pull that probe out of Jupiter's orbit and try and intercept 3i Atlas as best as it can to try and get a close-up image of this interstellar object. And yeah, I mean, it's a theory. It's going to be a challenging one, because Juno probe is actually running quite low on fuel, so the scientists will have to do some calculations on whether this is feasible or not. But that would be amazing if they can do this like a third of the way into 2026. That would be amazing. I'd love to see the outcome of that. But yeah, that's just a bit about 3i Atlas. The fact that, it's highly unusual in a multitude of ways. But yeah, I thought I'd kind of end the video on an even more unusual object. So I mentioned 3i Atlas being the third of 3 interstellar objects. There's two more previously to it, of course. One was Borisov, which is the second one that was detected, and that was detected recently by an amateur astronomer, I believe, and that kind of displayed more typical properties of a comet that we would expect on Earth. It did have unusual ratios like the CO2 ratio that I mentioned about 3i Atlas, but it wasn't as unusual as 3i Atlas. It was behaving more typically of a comet in terms of its approach, this, that, the other. But yeah, and sorry, just one more thing on 3i Atlas, because this is a very interesting thing as well. When you think about comets, so like one way Borisov, 2i Borisov was behaving typically like a comet was it had its tail pointing away from the sun as it was approaching the sun, like a typical comet. 3i Atlas, early on in its approach, it had a tail pointing towards the sun, which is just mind-blowing. Like, why would there be a tail pointing towards the sun? It was sublimating, so it was excreting particles towards the sun, which is very unusual. And now I believe it's obtained more of a typical comet tail from the latest findings that I've seen. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, that's just very unusual, you know. I'm just gonna shift over here. But yeah, so that was something that was very unusual about 3i Atlas, and something typical of a comet in Borisov. But just ending on this, I wanted to really touch on something very unusual about the first interstellar object that we discovered, which was Oumuamua, which is detected by a observatory in Hawaii. Now, why Oumuamua is so interesting is this is a tiny interstellar object. It didn't emit any form of tail whatsoever as it passed the sun. So we detected it very late in its journey, which is very sad because this is probably the most interesting of the three. And we just detected it when it was leaving our solar system, when it had passed our planet. So it was a bit sad. But even when we detected it then, it wasn't showing any indication of a tail whatsoever, which is very unusual. You would expect an interstellar object or a comet to be exhibiting some sort of a tail. But it wasn't emitting any particles whatsoever, which is very unusual, very, very unusual. No H2O, no CO2, nothing. Another that was detected by our instruments. Another thing that was very interesting about Oumuamua was it was, and I'm sure you've seen depictions of it, as a kind of cigar-shaped object. So the reason that they show it as a kind of cigar-shaped object was they were saying the ratio of its length to its width were highly unusual, on the degree of 8:1 or 5:1 or something like this, and hence they show it as a cigar-shaped object. Actually, with the latest modeling, it actually had more of a pancake-shaped surface, more of a pancake-shaped object. So it had like a ratio of 5:1, so kind of like my hand, very thin on the outside and very thick on the inside. So like a very pancakey shape, which is of course like that's not often something that we find in nature. Whether it was a cigar shaped or whether it was a pancake shape, this is not something that we've ever found in our solar system, and not something we would expect. But yeah, as I said, it was leaning more towards a pancake shape. And I have my own theories. I feel like, of course, with UFOs and them being that shape, scientists have an inert bias to kind of not portray images of Oumuamua as a pancake shape, because of course the general public will lean towards it being a UFO. But like, that's not something that you should be hiding. You should be kind of upfront about it, the fact that it was a pancake shape, and it did have 5:1 surface ratio. It's 5:1 ratio. Another thing interesting about Oumuamua was when it was leaving, when it was exiting that way, it actually accelerated a little bit, which is highly unusual, not something that we would typically expect. And yeah, you wouldn't expect non-gravitational acceleration, especially when you're not emitting anything, like you're not emitting any particles, and you're not having a tail. Why is Oumuamua accelerating when it's leaving the solar system? And yeah, because of reasons like that, because it doesn't have a tail, because of its weird ratio, because of it accelerating upon leaving, it's people have been hypothesizing about it being a artificial object, potentially a solar sail that was using the rays of the sun to kind of accelerate away. But yeah, I mean, of course the evidence at the moment is pointing towards it just being a very highly unusual natural object, but who knows, right? Oumuamua, out of the three, is the most likely to be artificial, if it was artificial. And of course that probability is still very low, but notable, especially for Oumuamua. So yeah, thanks all for listening. It's very interesting going through that with you guys. Keep your eyes out for 3i Atlas. There's a lot of news about 3i Atlas. There's a lot of comets also that are going to be approaching the sun at the end of this year. That some of them might be visible. So yeah, just keep your eyes out. Buy some binoculars, buy some telescopes. Keep your eyes out in the sky. Try and go to clear skies when you can. And yeah, just enjoy the time you have on this planet, because it's very short, and try and learn as much as you can. So thanks all for watching. I really enjoyed talking to you about these interstellar objects. Leave your questions in the comments below, and I'll look to address them the best I can, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.